Hello, comrades. This is probably going to be a three-part video now that I'm working on it, and this is going to be part two. If you watched part one, I ended the introductory video on an important note from Adrian Johnston's very overly academic analysis about Lukács and all this stuff. So I'm going to dumb it down for you and to explain that the main idea that I was trying to point out is that it is not that some Marxists are reductionists in their thinking about neoliberal economics as being the be-all and end-all of our human relationships, where the famous line from Marx, where everything solid turns into liquid. It is rather that the neoliberal economy is reductionist in and of itself. It is objectively reductionist. So the neoliberal economy, which has, as my long-ass video playlist has been trying to argue, taken over all of our institutions, wraps itself in this carceral feminist, actually, Crenshaw, Butler, and Bell Hook's moral grandstanding, from the APA to the CIA, and now through a covertly Ayn Randian moralization of the commodification of emotional labor, something that Milton Friedman and all of these guys were trying to do for a very long time, which was moralize it in terms of, in the past, when they were trying to moralize this move, they were trying to moralize it in terms of the capitalist, self-capitalist perspective, but now they've intelligently wrapped it up in Marxist discourse so that they pretend like this moralization of this commodification is actually a Marxist form of emancipation. Okay, so from the APA to the CIA, all of this covertly Ayn Randian moralization of the commodification of emotional labor, an incursion and revolution that has taken over the now very gaslighting disciplines of psychology and law and many other fields. And I'm going to be doing a video about how evolutionary psychology and psychology are not at odds with one another like they say they are. That is sadly working its way into even philosophy departments. Please watch my video on the conflict of the faculties. The faculty of philosophy is almost the only reserve within the ivory tower now where debate was once an awesome and fruitful activity where people could play with dangerous ideas. I mean, one of my favorite things to do was just like endless, arguments in the philosophy departments at McGill. I used to debate with quote analytic, positivist philosophers, but now I'm finding myself hiding behind them because they're the way more likely to defend the agora and the ideal of the public space or the public sphere, the ideal of it, or whatever remains left of whatever this ideal is, despite its many faults. The last barricade against the neoliberal incursion within the institutions that has already taken over science and all these other forms, this part in the ivory tower, which is the philosophy part, and actually anthropology as well. Anthropology is pretty good because if you look at my video Ritual Traces series, I point to how anthropology used to be the main form of colonialism, main form of unwitting colonialism. Now it's not anthropology that's the unwitting colonialism, because anthropology is very self-aware and as well very allied to philosophy in this sense, because they learned that about this way in which academia itself is so integral, so needed for taking over more resources, for going into new markets, and for destroying all of these forms of traditions, and in order to lubricate, in order to normalize this neoliberal subjectivity, and so that new markets can always arrive, new forms of financialization can happen. So, and the other last barricade were the concepts of family, which are every day falling apart even more, which is what the right wing is always gaining speed on. Community solidarity, which there is none anymore, because in the left, I used to be part of these feminist movements in the middle of these two these two feminist groups yelling at each other. I was like, as a male feminist, I was taught to listen to women. Why aren't you guys listening to each other? We should be listening to all the different all of the different traumas. Sometimes right now what we do is, again, we have to take these right-wing ideas like virtue signaling, um, uh, and Olympics, oppression Olympics is what they call it. These are potent right-wing ideas. They're very simple, and we need to actually address them, right? So this idea of oppression Olympics, we can unpack that a little bit and realize that there is something there, and there is actually a lot written in the literature that is not being paid attention to. People don't read. People don't read. Read more. You have to read more. So yeah, there is already in the literature, in the psychology literature, that is not the loudest psychology literature. It's now on the periphery, where they talk about how it's not good to play this my trauma is more important or more central than your trauma game, where, for example, Rothberg talks about how black black slavery and the Holocaust are always like at odds with each other, or my historical trauma is worth more, or this power and privilege game that just doesn't work in the public sphere, because we live in a world where there's thousands of different viewpoints, and unfortunately we are always forced into responding to this American perspective. And you know what? America is so narcissistic, right? So narcissistic that everyone has to respond to this American perspective. Everybody who has any type of criticism is supposedly a right wing of some sort. And there's it's not just as if one side is reacting to another. There's reaction and re-reaction happening, and we should listen to the whole re-reaction. We should actually listen what Butler says in this Holberg debate, which is not a debate at all. It's just everybody going, yes, yes, dear, yes, dear. It's like, it's not a debate at all. Whereas if Cornel West really, opened up his mind and really, because Cornell is always like, oh, everybody should work together, brothers, we're all brothers and sisters. And just as a side note, I was in the mountains in Switzerland, and there was this old Jewish man on top of the mountain, and he asked me where I'm from, and I asked him where he's from, and then at the end I was just like, yeah, you know what, we're all just brothers and sisters. I was very hippie at the time. He just looks at me, he's like, we're not brothers and sisters. Like, okay, well, that's hard work, that kind of, and that instance really got to me, because I was always in terms of this Cornell thing, Brother West that everybody calls him. So these last barricades of neoliberal incursion within our family, within our interpersonal relationships, within our intercommunal relationships, within our community solidarity, the very thing that is feeding right-wing paranoia about this so-called cultural Marxism. Yes, I'm aware that it's a right-wing thing, but we still need to take on those criticisms. It is not the commodification of emotional labor that I have a problem with. It is the moralization of the commodification of emotional labor that I have a problem with, which is much more powerful, right? Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, all of these old right-wing people, they were trying to moralize the commodification of every aspect of our lives, but they failed. They were laughed in philosophy institutions. They were laughed by the public. But when all of this was wrapped up in this Kimberly Crenshaw, bell hooks, and Butler kind of Gramscian Marxist analysis, that was able to be sold to the left, and in the worst way possible, where I used to be part of the groups of people that I was actually a student of Jordan Peterson, but I actually protested Jordan Peterson as well. I would go to rallies because I was a young kid, and I was part of that as well, until I saw that we were eating each other, that I was in the middle of two groups of feminists yelling at each other, not paying attention to each other, not listening to each other's trauma. It's like, look, these people have a legitimate grievance here, and so do these people, and we need to come together and talk to each other. But they both, because of this whole oppression of Olympics, they were calling each other misogynists. They were saying that it's too much emotional labor to educate one another. Excuse me, but wasn't that the whole point of Paulo Freire's pedagogy? Wasn't that the whole point of all this stuff? Anyway, so that means that they're actually arguing that, one, it is good, this moralization of the commodification of emotional labor. Two, it is necessary. And three, that it's a Marxist principle of emancipation to commodify your relationships with other people, such that you refuse to engage because you think or you can lay claim to the intentions of the people that disagree with you. It's incredibly dangerous. It's a dream for the right wing, this kind of not the lower class right wing, but the neoliberal class, the neoconservative class, the right wing people that want to make money, that they have to keep expanding money, keep expanding markets. It's a dream for them. So a viewpoint that can only come out of privilege, out of an Anglo tradition, that's very a specific thing as well. This is an Anglo tradition. Okay, you can't, the French and the Spanish traditions aren't so corrupt, and not even the Germans are so corrupt in terms of commodifying every aspect of our lives. It's the Anglo tradition that is really corrupt, and they have this polarized citational echo chamber. So if you look at their citations, they don't even cite outside of their viewpoint, right? I disagree with Richard Dawkins. I disagree with Sam Harris. I disagree with all of these people, but that doesn't mean I don't cite them, right? And this kind of argument is so reductionist, as Adrian Johnston says. And you can see that it's a specifically Anglo tradition because it's infecting India as well. And India is an Anglo culture. Now, if you think that I'm some TERF or Smurf or Swerf, I'm not talking about any of that. In fact, my argument is that we need to get rid of all of these arguments who say that refusing to engage in debate is actually productive. So, one, from Sarah Schulman, we learn that conflict is not abuse. Conflict is not abuse. Read that book. Amazing book. Two, from my own interpretation of Hegel, we learn that conflict is a ritualistic offering towards the possibility of creating a public good. And the irony that Adrian Johnston points out to dumbify his overly intellectualist way of saying this is that the people who are accusing some Marxists as being reductionists are in fact quite reductionists themselves when it comes to identity politics. And that was what I was trying to show in my last video as well. And it's so crazy how it's just this kind of infection within academia has happened. Okay, now let's look at the only point of tension that comes between Cornel West and Butler, where Butler is so habituated to responding to straw men that she actually strawmans the intellectual giant of Cornel West. She is so used to strawmanning that the straw man has become the pedagogy of the left. See, if you look at Simon Critchley's face, actually both Butler and Simon Critchley are my actual professors, by the way, it is obvious that he has a response to everything that Butler is saying, but he is the moderator. So he's a moderator, but the real reason he can't say anything is that if he was to say something, he is putting his social capital on the line, right? And this is why I look to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, if you're wondering, never called herself a feminist. Why did Hannah Arendt never call herself a feminist? It's because she had the instinct to realize that the personal is political is the ultimate gift to who? It's the ultimate gift to those who want to see all of our human relationships in terms of cost-benefit analysis. Those people in 1979 Foucault's lectures who try to turn every aspect of our life into commodity. Now, just to read a passage from this book called Foucault Against Himself. It's a series of interviews with different people that knew Foucault. So one of the questions is, would you say that psychiatry is a body of knowledge that can only exist within a certain exercise of power? Now, Geoffrey de Lasanieri, he responds in the perfect way, which I'm going to be criticizing here. This book is called Foucault Against Himself. So you can see Foucault never, he's ambivalent about whether neoliberalism is a good thing or not, right? So, and this is why the left has taken up this neoliberal perspective, right? In the classical tradition, when we think about knowledge, we always set it against, in the classical tradition, when we think about knowledge, we always set it and its truth against the, quote, political, against, quote, vested interests, quote, the normative, etc. One of the ways to disqualify a body of knowledge or the idea that a statement or proposition constitutes knowledge is to argue that the statement or proposition is political, vested, or normative. The value of truth is associated with the value of the universal and the transhistorical, etc. The very idea that Foucault defends in his Madness and Civilization, he defends this idea, but he's always ambivalent about it, okay? And in the order of things, and in the will to knowledge, is that we can retain the idea that something is true, quote, a body of knowledge, but at the same time accept that it has a vested historical and political interest. In fact, because of a body of knowledge presupposes a certain number of constructions of objects, that these objects that call for us to study them are received by us from the outside, such that they were constituted by the procedures of power and control mechanisms. In this way, this knowledge, but because we are dealing with the knowledge, we know it's political knowledge. That's how Foucault can speak of the politics of truth. Sorry, the wind is really crazy here. So I didn't read that in the best way, but to shorten the idea is that feminists in intersectional politics, they have taken up this Foucauldian line where propaganda is part of the vested interests are there within, and they're clear within. So you come up with all of these idioms, like if you do not agree with equality between male, if you agree between equality between male and female, then you obviously agree with equality, and you obviously agree with feminism. You already are a feminist, right? And there's all of these propagandic idioms, right? But Foucault himself also talks about the danger of overly using idioms and how the real vested interests become covered up within this obvious propagandization, right? So we all went through training in universities. We all went through different types of training about identity politics, and we learned a lot of that kind of stuff, or at work or whatever, or in the judicial setting. We all learn this stuff. But ask yourself, is something truly revolutionary when every aspect of the institutional paradigm take up this confessional perspective? It's not. So what's really happening is a double matrix, and I'm really looking forward to the next Matrix movie and how it's going to be bad. Maybe, I hope it's not bad, but how this line from Foucault's Against Himself is not just one matrix, it's many matrices, right? So that you really have to look at the vested interests underneath the stated vested interests. So it's not the fact that, oh, you are already a feminist if you agree between male and female equality. It's actually, hey, look, males and other males are not equal. There is no equality in the first place. So what are you talking about with regards to these so-called double standards?